This video was brought to you by Incogni. Hello friends, my name is JJ. So near the start of King Charles' coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey the other day, they had a little parade of all of the countries that are still under the British crown, including good old Canada, represented here by Prime Minister Trudeau, as well as our lesser-seen Governor General, Mary May Simon. On the one hand, this was kind of cool. The British are the best in the world at ceremonies because their attention to detail is so high, and this little parade marked a nice moment in the spotlight for a small club of countries that rarely get acknowledged in any sort of explicit way. On the other hand, however, the parade also served to remind that the number of countries under the British crown is extremely small at this point, and frankly consists of some of the most obscure and easily ignored nations on Earth, including places like Tuvalu and the Solomon Islands. 70 years ago, when Queen Elizabeth was crowned, the British Empire was still very much a thing, and the group of countries under the British monarchy was much larger and more relevant. A number of them were even given a call-out during her swearing in.
Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, Pakistan, and Ceylon, and of your possession and the other territories to any of them belonging or pertaining, according to their respective laws and customs?
I solemnly promise so to do.
At Charles's coronation, however, his oath used much more generic language.
Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, your other realms and the territories to any of them belonging or pertaining, according to their respective laws and customs?
I solemnly promise so to do.
This was presumably done on purpose to concede that it can no longer be taken for granted that the 14 countries in the parade are even going to stick with the monarchy for much longer. The Prime Minister of Jamaica, for instance, did not attend the ceremony because his government is currently in the process of cutting ties to the crown, just as the government of the next-door nation of Barbados did in 2021. Anyway, this is a long way of saying that the reign of Charles III may well herald the final dissolution of the bonds that tie the United Kingdom to what they used to call its dominions beyond the seas, but are now known by the somewhat less colonial term of Commonwealth realms. And with apathy towards the monarchy across these realms increasingly making headlines, I've been getting a lot of questions as to where the monarchy debate stands in Canada these days, the biggest Commonwealth realm of them all, and the one that I obviously know best. And I have to say that Canada is kind of a weird outlier as far as this stuff goes. Prime Minister Trudeau's government is very aggressively pro-monarchy, having gone out of its way to double down on the crown in the aftermath of the Queen's death and Charles's coronation. At a time when other Commonwealth realms have at least been making baby steps towards cutting this final tie with Britain, for example, by taking the monarch's face off the money or ditching the requirement that politicians swear an oath of allegiance, the Trudeau administration has pointedly refused to follow, with the Prime Minister openly expressing distaste towards those who question the value of the monarchy. He is now using the occasion of the coronation to affirm that Canada will in fact be continuing all of the standard royalist traditions. A press conference was held the other day announcing that the King is going to continue to appear on Canadian coins and Canadian stamps. There is also a new rendering of the crown that will be used on all the various crests of the Canadian government, and a new official flag to honor the King whenever that comes up. The government has also created this cute little cipher to serve as the King's Canadian coronation emblem, while a newly redesigned Canadian passport will feature a reference to King Charles on the first page. Additionally, we have been told that in the weeks to come, the Trudeau administration will be unveiling a new official portrait of the King to be displayed in all government buildings, a new design for Canada's $20 bill in which the King will replace the late Queen, and a new special medal featuring the King's face to be awarded to 30,000 of Canada's greatest patriots. Now, I imagine this will strike some foreigners as quite curious, given that Prime Minister Trudeau is probably one of the most famously progressive politicians in the world, and monarchism is often seen as a pretty conservative sort of thing. But here in Canada, ideologies often work in curious and unconventional ways. Before we continue, let me just take a moment to tell you about today's video sponsor, Incogni. Hello friends. So these days, it is of course a bit of a cliche for people like me to make ads saying things like, did you know that big corporations are collecting your data online? But just because it's a cliche doesn't mean that it's not true. Data collection is big business these days as industry leaders scrape the web for as much information as they can find in order to create ultra-detailed profiles of as many people as they can, which they then mostly sell to advertisers hawking everything from political candidates to male virility pills. I remember the New York Times did a cool project a while ago where they bought a bunch of ads that simply informed the viewer of what sort of data they had access to. But hey, maybe you're cool with that sort of targeted advertising. But I bet what you're not cool with is data breaches. This is when one of the big data collection companies gets robbed by hackers or whatnot. But what many people do not know is that under the laws of America, Canada, Europe, and Britain, citizens possess certain rights to request that these companies delete any of the data that they have collected. But JJ, you say, that sounds like a big bureaucratic hassle. Well, that is why Incogni is here to save the day. Brought to you by the Surfshark people, Incogni is an app that sends out automatic requests to all of the biggest data collection companies and politely asks them to delete what they have on you in accordance with your statutory rights. It is incredibly easy to use and a very valuable tool for anyone who cares about the security of their personal information on the interwebs. So why not give Incogni a try? The first 100 people to sign up using the promo code JJMCC get an amazing 60% off a yearly subscription. So don't delay, take control of your online data today. So I have often thought that in some ways, Canada works more like a Latin American country than a European one, in the sense that a lot of our most passionate nationalists tend to be on the left rather than the right. And that's because, much like in Latin America, a lot of Canadian nationalism is bound up in fears of being imperialistically exploited by the forces of American capital, which are assumed to be in cahoots with Canadian business interests and right-wing politicians. When a Conservative Party government proposed free trade with the United States in the 1980s, Canada's parties of the left very much framed their opposition to the idea in this sort of nationalistic way. You know, this notion that opening the doors to more American commerce would entail the final selling out of Canadian independence. Conservatives in Canada are routinely accused of wanting to Americanize Canada and seeking to undermine Canada's distinct culture, with distinct culture usually interpreted to mean the ways in which Canada is more left-wing than the US, especially when it comes to stuff like gun control and healthcare. But when you make opposing Americanization such a big part of your ideological motivation, it is only natural that you'll wind up playing defense for some of the more regressive elements of Canadian distinctiveness as well. Say, Canada's loyalty to the British Crown, which is something America abandoned in the name of democracy and equality quite some time ago. As the Canadian right became the country's more openly pro-American political faction in the late 20th century, there was a time when it seemed conservatives were drifting in the anti-monarchy direction as well. During the 80s and 90s, it was common to hear Canadians on the right, especially the more populist right, criticize Canada's ties to the Crown as being a wasteful burden on taxpayers, or the royals themselves as being unimpressive or immoral people. Canada's fringe right party, the People's Party, is quite anti-monarchy in a way I think sort of reflects this tradition. Similarly, Stephen Harper, the young man who in 2006 would become Canada's first Prime Minister under a newly reconstituted Conservative Party, was initially pretty open in his admiration of the American Republican system of government and pretty scornful of Canada's British-style parliamentary monarchy system in contrast. "I'm not a strong monarchist, I'm really not," he once quipped. However, when Harper became Prime Minister, his administration pretty much upheld Canada's monarchist status quo and even made a couple pro-monarchy overtures, like renaming the Canadian Navy the Royal Canadian Navy. There were a few reasons for this, but I would say that a big one was that by the 2010s, The question of history was starting to become an increasingly central political debate in Canada, as it was elsewhere in the world. As activists on the further end of the left began to portray Canadian history as being primarily defined by oppression, racism, and genocide, the right felt a contrary impulse to play defense for any manifestation of Canada's past, up to and including symbols of our history as a British colony. Today, I would say that there are plenty of right-wing Canadians who have learned to slot supporting the monarchy into a kind of broad anti-woke frame based on the idea that the far left is trying to cancel the king because he's a symbol of racist imperialism or whatever. Whether or not anyone in modern Canada is actually trying to cancel the monarchy is a pretty open question, however. Aside from a few hardcore Indigenous rights activists tearing down statues of Queen Victoria, I think it is hard to find much evidence that there's any real organized effort to undermine the crown. Like I said, the party of the mainstream left is pretty solidly okay with it, and even Canada's further left party, the NDP, has a pretty wishy-washy position on it. The current head of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, is the first boss of a national party in Canadian history to come out as openly anti-monarchy.
You would like, so that's it, you'd like to end the monarchy. You'd think Canada should be a republic, no more monarchy, no more connection to the crown.
Yeah, I don't see the relevance of it. I don't think that most Canadians do, but I'm open to hearing folks' concern on it, but that's my position.
But even then, it doesn't really seem like an issue that evokes much passion in him, one way or another. And one reason why is probably just that it's a fairly divisive issue within the NDP. We saw proof of this last year when there was a symbolic vote in the Canadian Parliament over whether or not to ditch the monarchy. All of the Conservative MPs voted no. All of the Liberal MPs, except one, voted no, but the NDP caucus split nearly 50-50, 10 in favor, 7 against. That motion, in case you were wondering, was brought to the floor by the French-Canadian Separatist Party, the Bloc Québécois, who I guess you could say are the most organized anti-monarchy force in Canadian politics. But on the other hand, they also conceptualized their anti-monarchism exclusively in the context of liberating the province of Quebec from English rule, so their republicanism is kind of narrow in focus. But all of that said, I think that one can very easily make the case that there really should be more efforts to undermine the monarchy in Canada, just because the evidence suggests that's what the Canadian public actually wants. According to an Angus Reid poll released last month, supporters of all of Canada's major political parties opposed the crown by solid majorities. The most decisive question went like this. After Queen Elizabeth II died last year, Charles was proclaimed king. Do you support or oppose Canada continuing to recognize him by swearing oaths to him, putting him on currency, and recognizing him as official head of state? 53% of Conservative voters were opposed, 56% of Liberal voters were opposed, and 70% of NDP voters were opposed. Overall, the total number of Canadians opposed to having Charles as Canada's symbolic ruler was 60%. Now, with numbers like these, it is fair to ask why the Canadian political class is so out of touch with public sentiment on the monarchy question, why the leadership of every major party is vastly more monarchist than their voters. A common rationalization of this you often hear is just, oh, it's because getting rid of the monarchy is too hard, our politicians are just being pragmatic with their time. And while it is true that Canada's constitution does set a rather high bar for abolishing the monarchy, requiring the approval of all of the provincial governments, that same Angus Reid poll found that only 6% of Canadians said they agreed with the statement, Canada should stick with the monarchy because changing the constitution is too difficult. But in any case, using difficulty as an excuse for political inaction is kind of a backwards logic, given the only reason why cutting ties to the monarchy is difficult in the first place is because so much of the political class is pro-monarchy. It would be one thing if everyone agreed that the king should go in theory, and our politicians were simply bogged down in endless argument over what kind of figurehead office should replace him. But instead, we have a situation where a large majority of the population doesn't care about the monarchy at all, governed by a political class that thinks, if anything, the government doesn't care about the monarchy enough. Now, my personal explanation for this is just that I think that the sort of people who tend to rise through the ranks of Canadian politics tend to have a different conception of this country than your average Canadian. I think Canadian politicians tend to be more nationalistic and anti-American than average, but I also think they tend to be more into the idea of government as something that deserves to have a high degree of pageantry and grandness to it, which monarchy obviously provides. There is a lot of royal ritual in the Canadian government, just as there is in England, and I think that when you make government your chosen profession, you naturally tend to enjoy and value this sort of stuff. A lot of Canadian politicians are also lawyers, and there's a lot of royalist ritual in the Canadian legal profession as well, and that probably fosters a similar degree of sentimentality. Canadian political academics tend to be very pro-monarchy too, as do a lot of the reporters and pundits who cover Canadian politics for a living. Both of Canada's national newspapers have a very solidly pro-monarchy editorial page, for instance. In short, if you happen to swim in the political waters in Canada, you probably inhabit a pretty broadly pro-monarchy environment. The only anti-monarchy voices you are likely to regularly encounter are Quebec separatists, and everybody hates them. But that said, I think that the elites in this country are not completely oblivious to the fact that public sentiment is not really on their side. And this is why, to the extent that anti-monarchy opinions are ever acknowledged, elite-type people tend to want to swat them down immediately in a way that can come off as a little condescending. A good example is this editorial, which was published in last year's Globe and Mail, which is Canada's leading center-left national newspaper, entitled "Canada is Stuck with the Monarchy. We should thank our lucky stars for that. This is how it begins." Forget About It is the name of an animated sitcom that ran for a few years on the Teletoon channel. It should also be the motto for anyone thinking about remaking Canada's constitutional monarchy or ditching it. Put such notions out of your mind. Do not go there. Forget about it. This sort of language tends to be the 1-2 punch against anti-monarchists in Canada. If you don't like it, it's because you don't appreciate it, and it's never going away anyway, so neener neener. It is a pretty obnoxious and, dare I say, undemocratic state of affairs. We have a monarchist establishment in Canada that is deep but not wide, and enjoys lording over a public that lacks much in the way of effective spokesmen or advocates willing to push back. Like, it would not be an exaggeration to say that I am probably one of the leading anti-monarchist people in Canada, and that is absolutely not a brag. It's like claiming to be the tallest building in Wichita, as they say. At one time, people like me nursed a lot of hope that loyalty to the monarchy would fade once Queen Elizabeth died, but the Trudeau government has since proven itself pretty eager to slam the door on that crack of opportunity. So it does look like the fundamental power imbalance keeping the monarchy in place is going to continue, and it is not clear where Canadian critics of the Crown, on the left, right, or center, should look for contrary leadership. As I said earlier, this lack of meaningful debate very much puts Canada at odds with basically all of the other Commonwealth realms. The monarchist side is winning in Canada, but it is a weirdly shallow victory, and the consequence might ultimately be that the next time a king is coronated in Great Britain, Canada will be leading a parade of one. So my closing question is this. Regardless of your personal stance on the Crown, what do you think it would take to shift the monarchy debate in Canada? What would that even look like? Let me know in the comments. Do not forget to check out Incogni, and I will see you next week.